A missing German Shepherd returns after 10 years. What the owner did next will break your heart. How far would you go to hold on to hope for a lost loved one? A decade after his beloved German Shepherd vanished, a farmer's quiet life is forever altered by an unexpected visitor at the edge of his field. What follows is an emotional journey of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. The choices he makes next will leave you deeply moved, making you question the true power of loyalty. The Montana morning was crisp and silent, the air carrying the scent of pine and dew as the first light stretched across the fields. Jake Miller rose early, as he always did, slipping on his worn boots before stepping onto the porch of his modest farmhouse. The sun peeked over the horizon, and his German Shepherd, Buddy, bounded out of the barn to greet him, tail wagging and eyes shining. "Morning, boy," Jake said, kneeling to ruffle the thick fur around Buddy's neck. The dog licked his face eagerly, his boundless energy a stark contrast to Jake's graying hair and weary expression. The days weren't as easy as they used to be, but with Buddy around, Jake didn't mind so much. Their life together was simple, built on a quiet companionship that needed no words. Jake had taken Buddy in as a pup nearly a decade ago, shortly after his wife Sarah had passed away. Sarah had always wanted a dog, and though Jake had resisted back then, thinking they didn't have the time or space, it had felt right to bring one home after she was gone. Buddy had filled the empty corners of the house and the aching spaces in Jake's heart. More than just a pet, he was family. Jake finished his coffee on the porch, the warmth of the mug seeping into his hands as Buddy stretched out beside him, his nose twitching at the sense of the new day. The river was calling to them. It was a ritual. Their trips down to the water were a way to unwind, to forget about the repairs needed on the tractor or the bills piling up on the counter. "Let's go, boy," Jake said, rising to his feet. Buddy leaped up, ears perked, his excitement contagious. They set off down the dirt path that led through the woods, Jake with a fishing pole slung over his shoulder and Buddy darting ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff a tree or chase a bird. The river sparkled when they reached it, its surface catching the sunlight in glittering shards. Jake settled on a flat rock near the bank, casting his line into the gently flowing water. Buddy splashed around in the shallows, barking at his reflection and snapping at passing dragonflies. Jake laughed, a deep, genuine sound that rippled through the air. It was moments like these that reminded him life still held joy, even if it came in small doses. The morning passed with ease, the two of them sharing the peaceful solitude of the river. Jake didn't catch much. He rarely did, but that wasn't the point. By midday, the sun hung high in the sky, and Jake began packing up. "Time to head back, buddy," he called, but the dog was already exploring the edge of the woods, his nose pressed to the ground. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You find something interesting over there?" he asked, watching Buddy disappear briefly into the underbrush. A few minutes passed, and when Buddy didn't return, Jake frowned. He stood scanning the tree line. "Buddy!" he called, his voice carrying through the forest. There was no response, only the sound of the river and the distant rustle of leaves. Jake's chest tightened as he set down his fishing gear and moved toward the woods. He'd seen Buddy wander off before, but he always came back, his tail wagging and his tongue lolling out as if to say, "Look what I found!" This time there was no sign of him. "Buddy!" Jake called again, louder this time, his voice tinged with worry. He pushed deeper into the trees, the cool shade offering little comfort as unease crept in. The forest seemed larger and darker than it had before, the shadows stretching endlessly between the trunks. Hours passed as Jake searched, his calls growing hoarse and his hope dimming. He retraced their steps, returned to the river, and combed every inch of the trail back to the farm, but Buddy was nowhere to be found. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jake stood alone by the water, his heart heavy. He sank to his knees on the riverbank, his hands pressed to the ground as he tried to steady his breathing. "Where are you, boy?" he whispered, his voice breaking. That night, Jake barely slept. He sat by the window staring out into the darkness, with Buddy's leash clutched in his hand. The barn light cast a dim glow over the yard, a beacon Jake left on, hoping against hope that Buddy would find his way back. The following days were a blur of desperate searching. Jake put up posters in town, talked to neighbors, and ventured deeper into the woods than he ever had before. But each effort ended in bitter disappointment. The forest, vast and indifferent, held its secrets tightly, offering no clues to Buddy's whereabouts. Weeks turned into months, and though Jake never truly stopped looking, he was forced to accept that Buddy might not return. The ache in his chest dulled over time, but never disappeared entirely. The house felt colder, the silence heavier without Buddy's presence. Jake kept the leash by the door and left the barn light on, just in case, but the hope he clung to was fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. Years passed and Jake's life moved forward in quiet increments. He threw himself into his work, repairing cars in town and tending to the farm, finding solace in the routines that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. Buddy remained a constant presence in his thoughts, though the sharp pang of loss had softened into a bittersweet memory. Jake often found himself smiling at the thought of Buddy chasing dragonflies by the river, his boundless energy a reminder of better days. One morning, 10 years after Buddy had vanished, Jake sat on the porch with his coffee, the rising sun casting a warm glow over the fields. The quiet was familiar now, though it still carried an echo of loneliness. As he gazed out at the horizon, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement at the edge of the field. He squinted, his heart skipping a beat as a figure emerged from the tree line. It was a dog, limping slightly, its fur streaked with gray, and its frame thin but unmistakable. Jake set his mug down, his breath hitching as the dog moved closer, its gait uneven but determined. "Buddy?" Jake whispered, rising to his feet. The dog stopped, its amber eyes meeting his, and in that instant, there was no doubt. "Buddy!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he ran toward the field. The dog's tail wagged weakly, and as Jake knelt, Buddy collapsed into his arms, his body trembling with exhaustion. Tears streamed down Jake's face as he held Buddy close, the years of loss and longing melting away in that moment of reunion. "You came back," Jake choked out, burying his face in Buddy's fur. "You came back." The morning light bathed them in warmth as man and dog sat together in the field, their bond unbroken by time or distance. It was as if the decade apart had never happened, and in that moment, Jake knew that Buddy had always been his guiding light, even in the darkest of days. The house was warmer now, not because of the spring sun streaming through the windows, but because Buddy was home. Jake Miller hadn't stopped smiling since the reunion, even as tears continued to spring to his eyes every time he looked at the frail but familiar form of his old companion. Buddy was resting on a thick blanket near the fireplace, his head nestled on his paws, his breathing slow but steady. Jake knelt beside him, gently stroking the dog's graying fur, marveling at the fact that, after 10 long years, Buddy had found his way back. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" Jake whispered. Buddy's tail gave a faint wag, and Jake chuckled softly, though his heart ached at the visible toll the years had taken on his friend. The first thing Jake did after their emotional reunion was to ensure Buddy was comfortable. He heated up a bowl of broth, coaxing Buddy to drink it slowly. The dog lapped at the liquid weakly, his eyes never leaving Jake's face, as if afraid this newfound safety might vanish. "Easy now," Jake said softly, wiping Buddy's muzzle with a cloth. "We've got all the time in the world to get you back on your feet." Despite his exhaustion, Buddy's spirit shone through. Over the next few days, he began to regain his strength, moving from the blanket by the fireplace to following Jake around the house in slow, deliberate steps. Jake kept his movements gentle, his voice low and soothing, as if afraid to startle the dog who had survived so much. When Buddy lay down at Jake's feet one evening, resting his head on the worn boots Jake still wore from their days working together, Jake felt the weight of their lost time press against his chest. Questions swirled in Jake's mind, even as he focused on caring for Buddy. Where had he been all these years? How had he survived? The dog's scars told a story Jake couldn't fully understand. Thin, jagged lines beneath his fur, calloused pads on his paws, and an ever-present alertness in his gaze. Buddy hadn't just survived, he'd endured, and Jake was determined to uncover the truth of his companion's journey. It wasn't long before word of Buddy's return spread through the small Montana town. Jake hadn't intended to share the news, but when he picked up supplies at the local feed store, The joy on his face betrayed him. Walter, the owner, leaned over the counter with wide eyes. "You mean to tell me Buddy came back after 10 years?" he asked incredulously, his voice carrying through the store. "Damn near thought you were pulling my leg, Jake." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "He came back," he said simply, though the weight of those words was anything but simple. It wasn't long before neighbors began stopping by, curious to see the German Shepherd whose return defied all odds. Jake welcomed them hesitantly, worried about overwhelming Buddy, but the dog handled the visits with quiet dignity, though he didn't move much from his spot by the fireplace. His eyes followed every visitor, his tail wagging faintly when familiar faces leaned down to greet him. "It's like he remembers all of us," Mary Ann, a neighbor, said one afternoon, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a miracle, Jake. That dog's got a story to tell." Jake nodded, his thoughts echoing her sentiment. He couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy's return was no accident, that there was something extraordinary about the dog's ability to endure the unimaginable and still find his way home. He began piecing together the clues from conversations with locals, a picture slowly forming of what might have happened during those lost years. One evening, while chatting with Walter at the feed store, Jake overheard a group of older men talking about a pack of stray dogs spotted near the abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. "Big fella leading them too," one man said, gesturing with his hands to indicate the size. "Looked like a shepherd. Been out there for years, keeping the others in line. Smart one too, knew how to avoid trouble." Jake's ears pricked at the description, and he turned to the group. "You said a German shepherd?" he asked, his voice careful but insistent. The man nodded. "Yeah, real proud-looking dog. We'd see him now and then when we drove past the quarry. Always stayed just out of reach, but you could tell he was watching over the others. Haven't seen him in a while, though. Maybe the pack moved on." The idea that Buddy had survived by leading a pack of strays stirred something deep within Jake. He couldn't help but picture his loyal friend, once so full of life, standing strong amidst the ruins of the quarry, protecting and guiding other abandoned souls. It fit with what Jake had always known about Buddy, his unyielding loyalty, his fierce intelligence. But it also broke Jake's heart to imagine the hardships the dog must have faced during those years. When Jake returned home, he found Buddy lying on the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. The dog's gaze seemed distant, as if he were looking beyond the fields, beyond the farm, to a place only he knew. Jake sat beside him, his hand resting gently on Buddy's back. "You were out there, weren't you?" Jake asked quietly. "Leading them, keeping them safe. That's just like you." Buddy didn't respond, but his ears twitched slightly, and Jake took it as confirmation. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Jake made a decision. He would visit the quarry. He didn't know if the pack was still there, or if he'd find anything at all, but he felt a pull to see the place that had been Buddy's refuge for so long. It was a chance to understand, to bridge the gap between the years they'd lost. The next morning, Jake loaded up his truck with water, food, and a few blankets, just in case. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to go. Buddy, still regaining his strength, stayed behind, watching Jake from the porch as the truck rumbled down the driveway. "I'll be back soon," Jake promised, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was as much for Buddy as it was for himself. The quarry was a desolate place, its crumbling walls and overgrown paths a stark reminder of abandonment. Jake climbed out of the truck, the sound of gravel crunching under his boots breaking the heavy silence. He called out tentatively, his voice echoing against the rocks. "Buddy, anyone here?" There was no response, but Jake wasn't discouraged. He walked the perimeter, noting the signs of what had once been a den. Scratches on the stone, a hollowed-out space beneath a ledge, tufts of fur caught on the brush. Though the pack was long gone, their presence lingered, and Jake could almost see Buddy standing there, watchful and determined. As Jake returned home that evening, he found Buddy waiting by the gate, his tail wagging weakly as Jake stepped out of the truck. Jake knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog. "I saw it, boy," he said softly. "I saw where you've been. You've done more than anyone could have asked, and now you're home. We'll figure it out together." The farm was quiet as night fell, but inside, the warmth of their reunion filled every corner. Though the past held its mysteries, Jake knew one thing for certain. Buddy had found his way back for a reason, and Jake would honor the love and loyalty that had brought them together again. Buddy's recovery continued with slow, steady progress, each passing day revealing glimmers of the vibrant dog Jake Miller remembered. The frail figure that had staggered into his field was growing stronger, his gait still uneven but more purposeful, and his eyes now held a familiar spark. Jake found himself marveling at Buddy's resilience, the dog's unyielding determination to reclaim some semblance of the life they had once shared. But along with the joy of having Buddy back came a growing curiosity, an ache to fully understand the decade that had separated them. Jake often sat with Buddy on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink below the distant hills, the sky painted in hues of gold and pink. Buddy would rest his head on Jake's knee, his body relaxed but his eyes always alert, scanning the horizon as though he were expecting something, or someone. It was a habit Jake had begun to notice more and more. Buddy's attention often drifted toward the tree line that marked the edge of the property, his ears perking at the faintest sound. It was as if a part of him was still tied to the wilderness he had called home for so long. One morning, as Jake sipped his coffee on the porch, he saw Buddy pacing near the edge of the field, his nose low to the ground. The dog seemed restless, his tail wagging intermittently as he sniffed the air. Jake set down his mug and walked over, crouching beside Buddy and scratching behind his ears. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Buddy responded with a soft whine, glancing back at the tree line. Jake followed his gaze, his brow furrowing. "You still thinking about the quarry?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. The quarry had been on Jake's mind as well since his visit a few days prior. The signs of the pack's presence, the hollowed-out dens, the worn trails, the faint scratches on the rock, had lingered in his thoughts, painting vivid pictures of Buddy's life among the strays. It was a life Jake couldn't fully imagine, one filled with survival, leadership, and sacrifice. He found himself wondering what had driven Buddy to leave it behind, to return to the farm after all these years. The answer seemed to rest somewhere in the dog's quiet moments, in the way he carried himself as though balancing the weight of two lives. These years, the answer seemed to rest somewhere in the dog's quiet moments, in the way he carried himself as though balancing the weight of two lives. That afternoon, as Jake worked on the tractor in the barn, Buddy sat nearby, his watchful gaze never straying far from Jake. The dog had become a constant presence once more, trailing Jake as he moved through his daily tasks. It felt natural, as though the decade apart had simply melted away. Yet there were moments, fleeting but poignant, when Buddy would stop, his ears swiveling toward a distant sound, his body tensing as if caught between two worlds. Jake noticed it again later that day when they took their usual walk along the riverbank. Buddy paused frequently, sniffing at the ground and raising his head to the breeze, his tail wagging faintly as though catching a familiar scent. "Something's still calling to you, isn't it?" Jake murmured, his voice quiet against the backdrop of the rushing water. Buddy glanced back at him, his eyes soft but searching, and Jake felt a pang of understanding. It wasn't that Buddy had fully left his old life behind. It was that he was learning to reconcile it with the one he'd returned to. The breakthrough came a few days later, when Jake decided to venture back to the quarry with Buddy by his side. He didn't know what he was hoping to find, but he felt compelled to revisit the place that had shaped Buddy's years in the wild. They set out early, the morning sun casting long shadows across the fields as Jake loaded water and supplies into the truck. Buddy climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation, his tail thumping against the seat as Jake started the engine. The drive was quiet, the road winding through dense woods before opening up to the rugged expanse of the quarry. When they arrived, Buddy leapt out of the truck, his movements slow but deliberate as he sniffed the air, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. Jake followed him, watching as the dog moved through the overgrown trails with a sense of familiarity. They reached the heart of the quarry, where the remnants of the pack's dens remained, and Jake knelt to examine the markings on the ground. "Looks like you had a real home here," Jake said softly, his hand brushing over the dirt. Buddy stood beside him, his body still but alert, his nose twitching as if the sense of the past lingered in the air. Jake couldn't help but feel a deep respect for what the dog had accomplished, building a life, a family in the face of abandonment and hardship. As they explored further, Jake noticed signs that the quarry wasn't entirely abandoned. Fresh paw prints marked the softer ground near a shaded alcove, and scraps of fur caught on the brush suggested the presence of other dogs. Buddy seemed to notice too, his body stiffening as he caught a scent. He let out a low bark, his tail wagging slowly as he padded toward the alcove. Jake followed, his heart pounding as a rustling sound emerged from the brush. A moment later, a small, wiry mutt stepped cautiously into view, its head low and its eyes wary. Behind it, another dog appeared, a lanky, golden-furred stray with a scar running across its flank. The two dogs froze when they saw Jake, their bodies tense, but their eyes darted toward Buddy. To Jake's astonishment, Buddy let out a soft whine, his tail wagging as he took a step forward. The mutt's ears perked, and the golden dog relaxed slightly, its head tilting as if recognizing Buddy. Jake stood still, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. It was clear these dogs knew Buddy, and that the bond they shared hadn't faded with time. After a few tense moments, the two strays retreated into the brush, but not before glancing back at Buddy, as though inviting him to follow. Buddy hesitated, looking between Jake and the direction the dogs had gone, his body torn between two instincts. Jake knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "It's okay, boy," he said gently. "You don't have to choose. We're here now, and we'll figure it out together." The trip back to the farm was quiet, but Jake felt a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. Buddy had lived two lives, one defined by the love and safety of the farm, and the other by the wild resilience of the quarry. Both had shaped him, and both deserved to be honored. That night, as Buddy lay curled at Jake's feet, the dogs breathing steady and content, Jake felt a deep gratitude for the journey they were on. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, their bond unbroken by time or distance. The days stretched into weeks as Jake worked to bring Buddy back to full health. Though the dog's age showed in his slower movements and the gray streaks lining his muzzle, his spirit remained unbroken. Jake marveled at Buddy's resilience, watching as the dog gradually regained strength. Each small milestone, an eager bark, a playful wag of his tail, or a steady trot beside Jake on the farm, brought a swell of pride and gratitude. Buddy had lived through so much, and now, after 10 years, he seemed determined to make the most of every moment they shared. One morning, as Jake sipped his coffee on the porch, Buddy rested at his feet, his head tilted slightly to catch the breeze. Jake ran his fingers absently through Buddy's thick fur, his thoughts returning to the quarry. The den-like space he had discovered there still lingered in his mind, a silent testament to Buddy's tenacity and the life he'd built in the wild. It haunted Jake to think of his beloved companion surviving alone, but he also felt a deep respect for the dog's strength. Jake glanced at Buddy, who was watching the horizon with his ears perked. "You kept them safe, didn't you?" Jake murmured. Buddy's tail thumped lightly against the wooden porch, and Jake smiled faintly, his chest tightening with emotion. There was so much Jake wanted to understand, but Buddy couldn't answer the questions that burned in his mind. What had happened during those lost years? How had Buddy ended up in the quarry? And why, after all this time, had he returned? Later that day, Jake decided to revisit the quarry. Buddy had grown strong enough to accompany him, and Jake hoped the trip might spark something, a memory or a sign, that could help him piece together the missing puzzle. The sun hung high as they made their way along the winding dirt road, the truck's tires kicking up a trail of dust. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the passing landscape with quiet curiosity. When they arrived, the quarry was as desolate as Jake remembered. The crumbling stone walls loomed high above, casting long shadows over the uneven ground. Jake stepped out of the truck, Buddy following close behind. The dog's movements were cautious but purposeful as he sniffed at the air, his nose twitching as if recognizing something familiar. "Take your time, boy," Jake said gently, watching as Buddy began to explore. They walked the perimeter together, Jake noting the signs of life that had once filled the quarry. Scratches marked the stone, and patches of flattened grass hinted at where the pack might have rested. Buddy moved slowly, his gaze darting between the ledges and crevices as if searching for something or someone. Jake felt a pang of sadness as he imagined Buddy leading a group of strays here, protecting them from the harsh elements and whatever dangers lurked in the wild. As they rounded a bend, Buddy froze, his body tensing. Jake followed his gaze to a small hollow beneath a rocky overhang. It was empty now, but the scent of old fur and the faint remains of a weathered chew toy told Jake all he needed to know. This had been home for Buddy and his pack. Jake crouched down, running his hand over the smooth stone. "You did good, Buddy," he said softly, glancing at the dog. "You kept them safe." Buddy stepped closer, his nose brushing against Jake's hand before he turned and padded back toward the truck. Jake lingered for a moment, the weight of the place settling over him. The quarry held its secrets tightly, but it also told a story of survival, of a dog who refused to give up despite the odds. Jake stood and followed Buddy, his resolve strengthening with each step. They couldn't change the past, but they could move forward together. Back on the farm, Jake and Buddy fell into a steady rhythm. The dog had become a fixture in every aspect of Jake's life, from the early morning chores to the quiet evenings on the porch. Buddy's presence brought a sense of purpose that Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing. The farm seemed brighter, the air lighter, as if Buddy's return had breathed new life into the place. One afternoon, as Jake repaired a section of fence near the back pasture, Buddy trotted ahead, barking at a squirrel darting through the underbrush. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Still chasing trouble, huh?" he called. Buddy wagged his tail, his bark echoing through the trees before he disappeared around a bend. A sudden yelp shattered the quiet, and Jake dropped his tools, his heart racing. He sprinted toward the sound, fear gripping him as he called Buddy's name. When he reached the clearing, he found Buddy standing stiffly, his hackles raised as he faced a stranger emerging from the woods. The man was tall and wiry, his clothes dusty, and his expression wary as he eyed Jake and Buddy. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice rough. He didn't move closer, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. Jake stepped forward, placing a hand on Buddy's back to calm him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone firm. The man hesitated, glancing at Buddy before speaking. "He looks familiar," he said slowly, nodding toward the dog. "Saw a shepherd like him once, years back, leading a pack near the quarry. Didn't think he'd still be alive." Jake felt a surge of protectiveness as he tightened his grip on Buddy's collar. "He's mine," Jake said evenly, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" The man held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Nothing, just passing through. Heard stories about that pack, how they survived out there, sticking together. Thought it was something worth seeing." He gave a faint smile before stepping back into the shadows of the trees. "You take care now." As the man disappeared, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Buddy pressed against his leg, his body tense, but his tail wagging faintly, as if to reassure Jake. "It's okay, boy," Jake murmured, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "We're safe." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on the porch with Buddy at his side. The encounter with the stranger had left him uneasy, but it also reaffirmed something he had always known. Buddy was special. The dog's loyalty, his strength, and the unbreakable bond they shared were rare gifts, ones Jake would never take for granted. The stars began to emerge, their light casting a soft glow over the farm. Jake reached down, resting his hand on Buddy's head as the dog let out a contented sigh. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" Jake said quietly. "But you came back. You came home." Buddy looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with trust and love. And in that moment, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as they always had. The past might hold its mysteries, but the future was theirs to build, one step at a time. Spring ripened into early summer, painting the fields around Jake Miller's farm in shades of green and gold. Wildflowers dotted the pastures, and the river that once carried Buddy's absence now seemed to flow with quiet gratitude for his return. Life settled into a steady rhythm for Jake and his loyal German shepherd, a rhythm that hummed with an unspoken understanding between man and dog. Yet even in this newfound peace, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the years they'd spent apart. Every time he looked into Buddy's amber eyes, now clouded slightly with age, he wondered about the sacrifices the dog must have made to survive and find his way home. Buddy had become inseparable from Jake, his presence woven into the fabric of the farm. Whether it was herding the chickens back to their coop, barking at a fox that strayed too close to the barn, or simply lying by Jake's side on the porch at the end of the day, Buddy's quiet resilience inspired Jake. He had always been a hard worker, but with Buddy by his side, Jake found a renewed sense of purpose. Each task felt lighter, each chore less burdensome. The dog's unwavering loyalty reminded Jake that life, even with its hardships, could still hold moments of profound beauty. One particular morning, Jake woke to the sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Buddy lay at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at the faintest noises outside. "Morning, old boy," Jake said, his voice thick with the remnants of sleep. Buddy lifted his head, wagging his tail lazily before hopping down from the bed and padding to the door. Jake chuckled as he got dressed, grabbing his hat and boots before following Buddy outside. The farm was bathed in the golden light of dawn, the air fresh and cool. Jake had plans to repair the tractor's engine that day, a task he'd been putting off for weeks. As he headed toward the barn, Buddy trotted alongside him, his steps lighter than they'd been when he first returned. The dog had regained much of his strength, though the years still weighed on him in subtle ways. A slight stiffness in his gait, a tendency to tire more quickly. Jake noticed these things, but he also saw the determination in Buddy's every movement, the quiet defiance that said, "I'm still here." As Jake worked on the tractor, Buddy sat nearby, watching intently as if he could understand the intricacies of the machine. Jake often talked to him while he worked, sharing thoughts he wouldn't voice to anyone else. "You know, I've been thinking about the quarry," Jake said, tightening a bolt. "About the pack you led. Must have been hard, keeping them all together. But you did it, didn't you?" Buddy tilted his head, his ears perking up at Jake's voice. "You're something special, boy," Jake continued, his tone soft. "Always have been." The day unfolded like so many others, filled with the quiet rhythms of farm life. But as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, an accident reminded Jake just how much he relied on Buddy. While loading hay bales into the barn, Jake misjudged the weight of one and stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose board. He fell hard, landing on his back with a sharp gasp as the air was knocked from his lungs. Pain shot through his side, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Buddy was at his side in an instant, barking urgently and nuzzling Jake's face. "I'm okay, Buddy," Jake managed, his voice strained as he tried to sit up. But the pain was sharper than he expected, and he sank back down, clutching his ribs. Buddy's barking didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder and more insistent, as if the dog understood that Jake needed help. Somehow, Buddy seemed to know exactly what to do. He sprinted toward the driveway, his bark carrying across the open fields. Jake, still lying on the barn floor, watched through the open door as Buddy reached the main road, his body tense and his tail high as he barked at an approaching truck. It was Walter, Jake's neighbor, coming by to drop off supplies. The truck screeched to a halt, and Walter jumped out, his face pale as Buddy ran circles around him, barking and pulling at his sleeve. "What's going on, boy?" Walter asked, glancing toward the barn. When he saw Jake lying on the ground, he didn't hesitate. "Jake!" he called, running over with Buddy at his heels. Together, they helped Jake to his feet, Walter supporting him as Buddy hovered close, his nose brushing against Jake's leg every few seconds. Walter drove Jake to the small clinic in town, Buddy riding in the back seat, his eyes never leaving Jake. The doctor confirmed that Jake had bruised a few ribs but was otherwise fine. "You're lucky," the doctor said. "Could have been a lot worse." Jake nodded, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Lucky I've got him." The days that followed were slower, Jake forced to rest more than he liked while his ribs healed. But even in this forced stillness, he found moments of joy. Buddy seemed to sense that Jake needed him more than ever, staying close and offering a comforting presence. At night, when the ache in Jake's side kept him awake, Buddy would lie beside the bed, his quiet breathing a steady reminder that Jake wasn't alone. As summer deepened, Jake and Buddy settled into a peaceful routine. The farm flourished under their care, the fields bursting with crops and the animals thriving. But more than that, Jake flourished. The emptiness he had carried for so many years seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet contentment he hadn't felt since Sarah was alive. Buddy had brought him back to life in ways Jake hadn't thought possible. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake and Buddy sat on the porch together. Jake held a glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping down the sides, while Buddy rested his head on Jake's knee. The air was warm and still, the only sounds the soft chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the river. "You know, Buddy," Jake said, his voice low and steady, "I don't know how you found your way back to me after all this time, but I'm glad you did. You saved me, you know that?" Buddy let out a soft huff, his tail wagging lazily as if to say, "I know." Jake leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on Buddy's head as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, Jake felt truly at peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. The bond they shared had endured time, distance, and hardship, and now as they sat side by side under the vast Montana sky, it felt unbreakable. Jake smiled, his heart full. "We've got a lot of good days left, don't we, boy?" he said softly. Buddy's tail thumped against the porch in reply, and in that moment, everything felt right with the world.